Picture this. It is 8:15 in the morning on February the 15th, 1991. The Florida Keys are bathed in the kind of golden winter light that makes you understand why people travel thousands of miles to reach this place. A group of windsurfers makes their way down a dirt road toward an area locals call the Horseshoe, a stretch of shoreline east of Big Pine Key and west of Bahia Honda Key, tucked away from the main highway, known only to those who seek out the perfect break. They are looking for wind and waves. What they find instead will haunt this place for nearly 30 years. She is lying face down in the water, partially submerged near the waterline. She is young, maybe 18, maybe 20. She is naked except for the pink bikini top twisted around her neck. Marks in the dirt show where she had been dragged. Her other clothes, a cardigan sweater and black moccasin booties, are scattered nearby. The windsurfers call law enforcement. And when the first responders arrive, they know immediately, this is bad. She has been beaten. She has been sexually assaulted. And she has been strangled to death with her own bikini top. What investigators do not know, what they will not know for 29 years, is her name. They do not know where she came from. They do not know who loved her, who missed her, or whether anyone in the world even knew she was gone. For nearly 3 decades, she would carry no name. She would be known only as Valentine Jane Doe, because she was killed on the most romantic night of the calendar year, the night the whole world sends flowers and whispers promises of love. Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 1991. Detectives chased every lead. The case landed on Unsolved Mysteries. Tips poured in by the hundreds. Investigators kept 4,000 pages of documentation. And still, nothing. Nobody reported her missing. Not a single person filed a report. Until science caught up. Until DNA technology evolved into something powerful enough to reach back across 3 decades and pull this young woman back from anonymity, along with the man who killed her. Because when the Monroe County Sheriff's Office finally got their answers in June of 2020, they got them both at once. They got her name. And they got his. Her name was Wanda Deann Kirkum. She was 18 years old. She was from Hornell, New York, a small upstate town, far from Florida. She had a heart tattooed on her left shoulder with the word love inside it. And she deserved so much more than what this world gave her. His name was Robert Lynn Bradley. He was 30 years old when he killed her. And exactly 14 months later, he would be murdered himself, shot multiple times in the head and dumped in a ditch in Tarrant County, Texas. His own murder scene would be the key to unlocking the mystery of who killed Wanda Kirkum. This is their story. Both of them. The girl who had no name for 29 years. And the killer who died before justice could find him. Welcome to Buried Secret Media. If you're new here, welcome to Buried Secret Media, where no cold case stays cold forever. Make sure you like this video so more people find Wanda's story. Drop a comment below. Her name was Wanda Deann Kirkum, and she deserves to be remembered. And hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive documentary like this one. Let's get into it. To understand what happened to Wanda Deann Kirkum, you first need to understand where it happened. You need to understand the Florida Keys in 1991. The Florida Keys are a 113-mile-long archipelago stretching from the southern tip of Florida's mainland peninsula into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. They are connected by a single road, the Overseas Highway, officially designated United States Route 1, that cuts like a lifeline through turquoise water, mangrove islands, and coral reef systems teeming with life. At the very end sits Key West, a quirky, sun-drunk city that has drawn artists, writers, and wanderers for generations. In 1991, the Keys had a particular kind of energy. The economy revolved around tourism, fishing, and a countercultural spirit that attracted people seeking escape. Ernest Hemingway had lived in Key West. Jimmy Buffett had sung about the lifestyle. The entire stretch of U.S. Route 1 from Miami down through the Keys had a reputation as the road you drove when you needed to disappear, to reinvent yourself, to leave the past behind. But every paradise has a shadow side. The same geography that made the islands beautiful, isolated, rural, connected by a single highway with no alternate routes, also made them vulnerable. Travelers passed through constantly. Hitchhikers were common along the highway. The population was spread thin across more than 100 miles of island chain. Law enforcement coverage was stretched across a vast and challenging jurisdiction. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office was responsible for the unincorporated areas of the Keys, everything outside Key West, and the smaller incorporated towns. They were good at their jobs, but they were also working in a jurisdiction that presented unique challenges. When a crime occurred in the middle of that Long Island chain, witnesses were scarce. Evidence could be compromised by water, wind, and wildlife. And if someone wanted to hide a body, there were countless isolated dirt roads and hidden beaches where a person could simply vanish. The area known as the Horseshoe sits near mile marker 35 on the Overseas Highway, east of Big Pine Key and west of Bahia Honda Key, roughly in the middle of the island chain. It was a local spot, known to residents who used it for water sports and fishing. The dirt road that led to it was not marked. It was not the kind of place you stumbled upon by accident. Whoever brought Wanda Deann Kirkum there on the night of February the 14th, 1991, knew, or had some knowledge of, the isolated stretches of road between the Keys' scattered communities. February in the Keys is winter by the calendar, but summer by the temperature. Days are warm, typically in the low to mid-70s. Nights drop into the pleasant 60s. It is the season when tourists come to escape the snow. It is also the season when young people with no money and a lot of miles to cover still hitchhike, because in 1991, hitchhiking was not yet the taboo it has become today. It was into this world, beautiful, isolated, deceptively casual, that Wanda Deann Kirkum arrived. We do not know exactly how she got to Key West, or when, or why. What we know is that by the evening of February the 14th, 1991, she was there. She was 18 years old. She was alone. And she was trying to get out. She had no idea that the ride she was about to accept would be her last. The Florida Keys in 1991 represented a unique convergence of American geography, culture, and criminal vulnerability. To understand how Wanda Deann Kirkum could die there and remain unidentified for 29 years, you need to understand not just the physical landscape, but the social landscape. The particular mix of transient populations, seasonal workers, tourists, and permanent residents that made the Keys both a paradise and, for some, a trap. The Overseas Highway itself is a cultural artifact as much as it is a physical structure. Built in the 1930s to replace Henry Flagler's railroad, which had been destroyed by the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, the highway transformed the Keys from an isolated chain of islands accessible mainly by boat into a connected corridor that anyone with a car could traverse. By the 1990s, U.S. Route 1 from Miami to Key West had become one of America's iconic road trips, a drive through shimmering water and small island communities that promised escape from the mainland's complications. This promise of escape attracted certain types of people. Artists came for the light and the laid-back atmosphere. Writers came for the Hemingway mystique. Retirees came for the warm winters. But the Keys also attracted people who were running from something. Failed relationships, legal troubles, family dysfunction, debt, addiction. The transient population of the Keys included people who had come to start over, people who had come to disappear, and people who were simply passing through on their way to somewhere else. Hitchhiking was common along the Overseas Highway in the early 1990s. Young people traveling on minimal budgets would catch rides from Key West back to the mainland, or from Miami down to Key West. The practice was risky, everyone knew that, but it was also normalized by the sheer volume of people who did it without incident. For every horror story, there were 100 uneventful rides. The problem was that you never knew which category your ride would fall into until it was too late. The seasonal nature of the Keys' economy also contributed to population flux. Winter was high season. Tourists flooded in to escape snow and cold, and businesses hired temporary workers to handle the increased demand. Summer was slower, with many seasonal businesses closing or reducing hours, and temporary workers leaving for jobs elsewhere. This constant churn of people made it difficult for law enforcement to track who was in the area at any given time. Someone could be in Key West for 2 weeks, commit a crime, and disappear back to the mainland before anyone even realized they had been there. Law enforcement in the Keys faced unique challenges. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office had jurisdiction over the unincorporated areas, but they were covering more than 100 miles of highway and scattered island communities with limited resources. Response times could be long when incidents occurred in remote areas. Witness availability was complicated by the transient population. Evidence could be compromised by exposure to salt water, wind, and humidity. The Keys were beautiful, but they were also difficult to police effectively. Drug trafficking was another factor in the Keys' criminal landscape of the 1990s. The region's proximity to the Caribbean and South America, combined with countless secluded beaches and waterways, made it a natural corridor for drug smuggling. While most trafficking occurred at sea, the presence of that economy in the region brought associated violence and criminal activity. People who moved through those circles, dealers, couriers, enforcers, were exactly the kind of people who might pick up a hitchhiker with bad intentions. The social services infrastructure in the Keys was limited. There were few shelters, few resources for vulnerable young people, few organizations equipped to help someone like Wanda Kirkum if she had been in trouble and needed assistance. The nearest major city with comprehensive social services was Miami, more than 100 miles away. If a young woman was in a dangerous situation in the Keys, her options were limited. She could try to get to Miami, she could try to call someone she knew back home, or she could try to handle it herself. Wanda chose to hitchhike north. That decision killed her. Understanding this context, the transient culture, the geographic isolation, the limited law enforcement coverage, the social services gaps, helps explain how a young woman could be murdered on Valentine's Day in 1991 and have nobody report her missing. She was moving through a world where people came and went constantly, where the social safety net had holes big enough for a person to fall through entirely, where the beautiful landscape concealed harsh realities about vulnerability and violence. Valentine's Day, 1991. The day the world celebrates love. Somewhere in Key West, Wanda Deann Kirkum makes a decision. She is leaving. She is heading north. Maybe she is going home to Hornell, New York. Maybe she is going somewhere else. We do not know. What we know is that multiple witnesses see her on the evening of February the 14th, standing on the shoulder of U.S. Route 1 with her thumb out, trying to catch a ride northbound. Hitchhiking in the Florida Keys, especially heading north toward the mainland, is straightforward in geographic terms. There is only one road. You stand on the shoulder, you face traffic, and you wait. Sooner or later, somebody stops. In the early 1990s, enough people still hitchhiked that the practice was not unusual. For a young person with no car and no money, it was often the only practical way to get anywhere. The witnesses who later spoke with investigators pieced together Wanda Kirkum's final documented movements with precision. She was seen hitchhiking northbound on U.S. Route 1 on the evening of Valentine's Day. The timeline was specific. The location was specific. And the last confirmed sighting would become a critical marker in the investigation. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, Wanda Deann Kirkum was spotted for the last time near mile marker 17 on the overseas highway. Still northbound. Still with her thumb out. Still trying to catch a ride that would take her away from Key West. And then she vanished. After 6:30 p.m. on February the 14th, 1991, there are no more witnesses. No more sightings. No more documented evidence of Wanda Deann Kirkum moving through the world under her own power. What happened next is reconstructed from physical evidence and forensic examination. Someone stopped for her. Someone offered her a ride. Maybe he seemed safe. Maybe he seemed friendly. Maybe he said all the right things a young woman alone on a dark highway would need to hear to trust him enough to get in. But instead of taking her north, he took her nearly 20 miles in the opposite direction, to a dirt road off the highway near mile marker 35, the road that leads to the Horseshoe. 20 miles from where she was last seen alive. 20 miles in which everything changed. The forensic evidence tells the story her voice cannot. Wanda Kirkum was beaten. She was sexually assaulted. And then, using the pink bikini top she had been wearing, she was strangled to death. She was left face down in the water near the shoreline, naked except for the ligature around her neck. Her cardigan sweater and black moccasin booties were found nearby. The scene was calculated, purposeful, the work of someone who had done what he intended to do and then walked away. The next morning, February the 15th, at approximately 8:15, a group of windsurfers walks down that dirt road toward the Horseshoe. They are looking for the water. They find her instead. They call law enforcement. And the Monroe County Sheriff's Office receives the call that will open a case that will not close for 29 years. The crime scene that greeted responding officers on that February morning was one of the most difficult they would encounter, not because it was complex, but because of the complete absence of the one thing investigators most need, a name. The victim was a young woman, approximately 18 to 20 years old. She was white. She had light-colored hair. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 110 pounds. She had a slight, slender frame. Her teeth were perfect, well cared for, straight, healthy, suggesting that at some point in her life, someone had taken her to a dentist regularly. Despite the violence that had ended her life, her face was not badly damaged, and investigators noted she had pleasant, natural features. But the most telling detail was this: she had no tan lines. None. In the Florida Keys in February, anyone who had been in the region for any meaningful length of time would show sun exposure, bronzed skin, visible tan lines from swimwear or clothing. This young woman showed nothing. Her skin was pale and untouched by the Florida sun. The absence of tan lines on her body suggested she was not from Florida, and investigators immediately knew they were looking for someone from somewhere else, somewhere north, somewhere far from this subtropical paradise. Her tattoos were carefully documented. On her left shoulder, she had a small heart tattoo with the word love written inside it. On the webbing near her left thumb, the thin skin between the thumb and forefinger, she had a tiny cross with sun rays emanating from it. Both tattoos were simple but deliberate. They were personal. They meant something to her. Her ears held additional identifying details. Each ear had 4 piercings. The left ear held 2 non-matching earrings. The right ear held 4 non-matching earrings. The mix of mismatched jewelry suggested a young woman with an eclectic personal style, someone who wore what she liked rather than what matched. Her clothing offered perhaps the most significant clue to her origins. The cardigan sweater she had been wearing was a Forenza brand, popular in the late 1980s and early 90s, primarily sold through limited stores. The black moccasin booties were the kind of footwear far more practical for a northern autumn or winter than for the Florida Keys in any season. Taken together with the absence of tan lines, the clothing painted a clear picture. This young woman was from somewhere cold, somewhere far from here. The cause of death was determined by forensic examination to be strangulation by ligature, specifically by the pink bikini top that had been used as a weapon. But strangulation was the final act. Before it came beating. Before it came sexual assault. The full picture painted by the physical evidence was of a prolonged and violent attack by someone who felt no hesitation and no mercy. What investigators did not have, what made this case uniquely difficult from its first moments, was any identifying documentation. No wallet, no identification card, no purse, no personal effects beyond the clothing, nothing with a name on it, nothing that pointed to who she was or where she had come from. She was a young woman who had arrived in the Florida Keys with almost nothing, and she had died with almost nothing, and the nothing made finding her name feel nearly impossible. DNA samples were collected from the crime scene, biological material left by the killer, preserved and cataloged with the expectation that someday there would be a database capable of matching it to a name. In 1991, the FBI's CODIS system, the Combined DNA Index System, was in its infancy. But investigators knew DNA was the future. They preserved what they had. The case file was opened. The investigation began. And a name that would not be known for 29 years was given to her in the meantime: Valentine Jane Doe. The Valentine, because of the day she was killed. The Jane Doe, because that is what you call a woman the world has not yet claimed. When Monroe County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Horseshoe on the morning of February the 15th, 1991, they faced a crime scene that would require meticulous processing. The location itself presented challenges. The dirt road leading to the scene was not regularly maintained. The beach area was exposed to wind, water, and wildlife. Every hour that passed increased the risk of evidence degradation or contamination. Crime scene investigators photographed everything: the body in situ, its position, the surrounding terrain, the marks in the dirt showing how it had been dragged, the scattered clothing, the pink bikini top used as the murder weapon. Each photograph would become part of a permanent record that investigators would review hundreds of times over the next 29 years, looking for details they might have missed on first examination. The process of documenting an unidentified victim requires particular care. Without a name, without a missing persons report to compare against, physical details become everything. Investigators measured her height precisely, 5 feet 4 inches. They recorded her weight, approximately 110 pounds. They documented every visible mark, scar, or distinctive feature. The tattoos were photographed from multiple angles, with rulers placed beside them to establish scale. The piercings in her ears were counted and documented. Even the condition of her fingernails was noted, clean, well-maintained, another small indication that at some point in her life, someone had taught her basic self-care. The clothing was collected and bagged separately. The Forenza cardigan sweater, investigators noted the brand, the size, the style number printed on the label. They documented its condition, gently worn, clean, no visible damage beyond what had occurred during the attack. The black moccasin booties were similarly documented. Size, brand if identifiable, or patterns on the soles that might indicate how long she had been wearing them. These details, seemingly minor at the time, would later help establish that Wanda had likely been in Florida only a short time before her death. The forensic examination that followed would provide the medical details necessary to understand exactly what had happened. The medical examiner determined the cause of death, strangulation by ligature, specifically the bikini top that had been twisted around her neck with enough force to cut off her airway. But the examination also documented the injuries that preceded her death. Blunt force trauma consistent with beating. Internal injuries consistent with sexual assault. The pattern of injuries told the story of a sustained, brutal attack, not a crime of passion or sudden impulse, but a calculated act of violence. DNA collection in 1991 was still a relatively new practice in local law enforcement, but the Monroe County investigators understood its potential importance. Biological samples were collected from the victim's body and from the crime scene. These samples were preserved using the best practices available at the time. Frozen storage in controlled conditions, careful documentation of chain of custody, meticulous labeling to ensure they could be located and identified decades later if necessary. The decision to collect and preserve that DNA would prove to be the single most important investigative action taken in the entire case. The beach area itself was searched systematically. Investigators walked grid patterns, looking for anything that might belong to the victim or the perpetrator. A cigarette butt, a piece of torn fabric, tire tracks in the soft sand near the dirt road, footprints, any physical evidence that might have been left behind. The search yielded limited results. The exposure of the scene to weather and tide had already begun the process of erasing evidence. But what they found was carefully documented and preserved. One of the most haunting aspects of processing the Valentine Jane Doe crime scene was the complete absence of any identification. No purse, no wallet, no identification card, no receipt with a name on it, no piece of mail, no key with an address tag, nothing that would have made the process of identifying her straightforward. This absence suggested one of two possibilities. Either she had been traveling with almost nothing to begin with, or the perpetrator had taken her personal effects with him when he left. Both possibilities raised troubling questions about what had happened and why. The investigation in those first critical hours and days would establish the foundation for everything that followed. The physical evidence collected at the scene, the DNA samples preserved in proper storage, the photographs taken from every angle, the witness statements gathered from the people who had seen her hitchhiking on Valentine's Day, all of this became part of a case file that would eventually grow to 4,000 pages. And all of it would wait, preserved and documented, for the day when technology would finally be able to use it. From the moment the Monroe County Sheriff's Office opened the Valentine Jane Doe case, detectives faced a challenge that is among the hardest in law enforcement, trying to identify a victim who has left no trail. The first and most logical step was a national missing persons search. Investigators compiled Valentine Jane Doe's physical description, height, weight, estimated age, hair color, distinctive tattoos, distinctive ear piercings, absence of tan lines, perfect teeth, and compared it against missing persons reports from across the country. They reached out to law enforcement agencies in other states. They submitted information to the FBI. They looked for anything that matched, and they found nothing. Nobody matching her description had been reported missing. Not one report. Not anywhere in the national database. This silence was devastating. The failure of a missing persons report to surface meant one of several things. Either her disappearance had gone unnoticed, or no one cared enough to report it, or the people in her life had chosen, for whatever reason, not to involve the authorities. In a young woman's murder, that silence spoke volumes. Witnesses who had seen her hitchhiking on Valentine's Day provided what information they could. They described a young woman traveling light, moving with purpose, heading north. She had been alive and moving under her own power as late as 6:30 in the evening near mile marker 17. This meant there was potentially at least one other driver who had picked her up briefly and let her out again without incident. A driver who might be a witness, if only they would come forward. No one did. Investigators worked the case with everything they had. The beach and surrounding area were searched carefully. The dirt road leading to the Horseshoe was processed for physical evidence. DNA samples were preserved. Forensic artists created composite drawings of what Valentine Jane Doe had looked like in life. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became involved, helping to produce and distribute detailed visual descriptions of the unidentified victim. Tips began to come in. Some were promising. All had to be investigated. And as the weeks turned to months and the months turned to years, the case joined the grim category of cold cases. Investigations that remained technically open but practically frozen, kept alive by the dedication of specific investigators who refused to let them die. One person who kept the case alive was a dispatcher with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office who had taken the very first call when the windsurfers found Wanda's body that February morning. According to family members who would later speak to the press, this dispatcher carried the case in her heart for decades. She kept it top of mind. She kept reminding her colleagues. She did not let Valentine Jane Doe become just another number in a filing system. Lieutenant Manuel Cuervo of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department would later speak publicly about what it was like to work on a case that refused to yield. You wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, did we look at this? Who is she? Is there anything that we missed in looking at the evidence? That is the psychological weight of an unsolved case. The grinding, sleepless knowledge that somewhere in the evidence you have accumulated, there is an answer you have not yet found. By the time the investigation accumulated 4,000 pages of documentation, 4,000 pages representing tips followed, witnesses interviewed, leads pursued to their ends, the Valentine Jane Doe case had become one of the most thoroughly investigated cold cases in Monroe County history. And still, they had no name. Every cold case presents its own unique challenges, but the Valentine Jane Doe case combined multiple layers of difficulty that made it one of the most stubborn unsolved cases in Monroe County history. Understanding these challenges helps illuminate why the case remained unsolved for 29 years and what finally allowed it to be cracked. The first and most obvious challenge was the lack of victim identification. In a typical homicide investigation, investigators know who the victim is from the start. They can interview family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors. They can examine the victim's phone records, financial records, social media, work history. They can reconstruct the victim's movements in the days and weeks leading up to the crime. All of this helps establish motive, identify suspects, and build a timeline. In the Valentine Jane Doe case, none of that was available. Investigators did not even know the victim's real name, let alone anything about her life, her associates, or her movements before she arrived in Key West. The witness statements, while helpful in establishing a timeline, were limited in their investigative value. Multiple people had seen Wanda hitchhiking on Valentine's Day evening near mile marker 17. These witnesses could confirm she had been alive, moving north, trying to get a ride. But they could not identify her. They could not say whether they had seen her earlier in the day or where she had been. And critically, nobody came forward to say they had given her a ride, which meant that either the driver who picked her up did not recognize himself in later media reports about the case, or that driver was Robert Lynn Bradley, and he was already dead by the time the case received significant media attention. The crime scene, while properly processed, yielded limited forensic evidence beyond the DNA. There were no fingerprints on usable surfaces, no clear tire tracks, no witnesses who had seen a vehicle at the dirt road leading to the Horseshoe, no physical evidence connecting the crime to any specific person or vehicle. The DNA was the strongest piece of evidence, but in 1991, DNA evidence was far less useful than it would become decades later. The technology to match DNA profiles existed, but the databases did not. Without a suspect to compare against, the DNA just sat in storage, waiting for future technology. The geographical challenges were significant. The crime occurred in the middle of a Long Island chain, at a semi-remote location accessible by dirt road. The perpetrator could have come from anywhere, Miami, Key West, any of the communities in between. He could have been a local resident, a seasonal worker, a tourist, a transient passing through. Without a victim identity to provide context, there was no way to narrow the geographic scope of the investigation. Investigators were looking for a needle in a haystack that stretched from Miami to Key West and potentially beyond. The missing persons database searches yielded nothing because Wanda Kirkum was never reported missing. This was perhaps the single most significant obstacle the investigation faced. In the era before DNA could be used to identify unknown victims through genetic genealogy, the primary pathway to identification was matching unidentified remains against missing persons reports. When that pathway does not exist, when nobody files a report, the investigation hits a wall. Investigators ran Wanda's description through every database they had access to. They checked with law enforcement agencies across the country. They publicized the case on Unsolved Mysteries and other programs, generating hundreds of tips. But without a missing persons report from someone who actually knew her, all of those efforts led nowhere. The media attention, while helpful in keeping the case in the public consciousness, also created challenges. The hundreds of tips generated by the Unsolved Mysteries segment had to be individually investigated and ruled out. Each tip represented potential investigative time, phone calls to make, records to check, sometimes trips to other states to interview witnesses or examine evidence. The vast majority of tips, despite being offered in good faith, did not lead anywhere productive. But every single one had to be checked, because the one tip that did not get followed up on might have been the breakthrough the case needed. The passage of time itself became a challenge. As the years turned to decades, the case file grew larger, but the likelihood of a conventional investigative breakthrough grew smaller. Witnesses' memories faded. Physical evidence degraded. People who might have had relevant information died or moved away. The detectives who had worked the case in the early years retired, and new investigators had to come up to speed on a massive file with no clear leads. The case did not go cold because investigators gave up. It went cold because every conventional investigative avenue had been exhausted without success. The final challenge was resource allocation. Cold cases compete for investigative time and budget with current cases that demand immediate attention. A detective working a cold case from 1991 also has active homicide investigations, rape cases, assaults, and other violent crimes that require immediate response. The question of how much time to devote to a decades-old case with no clear leads is a difficult one, answered differently by different agencies and different investigators. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office kept the Valentine Jane Doe case active, kept returning to it, kept the evidence preserved. But they also had to balance that commitment against current demands. The fact that they never gave up, that they kept 4,000 pages of documentation, kept the DNA samples properly stored, kept checking new databases as they became available, is a testament to their professionalism and their commitment to Wanda Kirkum. In the early 1990s, there was no more powerful tool for generating public tips on cold cases than the television program Unsolved Mysteries. The show, which ran from 1987 through 2010 in various incarnations, pioneered the use of dramatic reenactments and direct appeals to the viewing public to help solve real crimes. Hosted by Robert Stack in his signature trench coat, Unsolved Mysteries became appointment television for millions of Americans. When a case was featured on the show, tip lines lit up. Investigators who had gone months or years without a viable lead would suddenly find themselves fielding hundreds of calls. The Valentine Jane Doe case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. The response was exactly what investigators had hoped for. Hundreds of tips flooded in. People from across the country called with information. They thought they recognized the composite drawing. They remembered a friend who had gone missing around that time. They had seen someone who matched the description. Each tip had to be investigated. Each claim had to be checked against the physical evidence. Investigators compared the details provided by callers against what they knew. The tattoos, the piercings, the clothing, the physical build, the absence of tan lines, the perfect teeth. Some tips were promising enough to pursue seriously. Follow-up calls were made. Records were checked. In several instances, investigators traveled to compare information in person. But the hundreds of tips yielded nothing definitive. When each lead was exhausted, Investigators found themselves back where they started, a young woman with a heart tattoo and mismatched earrings, lying unnamed in a Florida social services vault. The Valentine Jane Doe case also attracted attention from other true crime programs over the years. Crime Watch Daily ran a feature on the case in 2016, including an interview with Lieutenant Cuervo that brought national attention back to the mystery. The FBI entered the case information into VALENTINE'S, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, their national database designed to link violent crimes across jurisdictions. The 4,000 pages of investigative documentation accumulated by the Monroe County Sheriff's Office represent an extraordinary commitment of resources to a single case. Each page represents a tip followed up on, a witness interviewed, a lead pursued. The dedication embedded in that number is humbling. The fact that it still was not enough, not for 29 years, speaks to the near-perfect storm of obstacles that surrounded this particular case. The most fundamental obstacle was the one that had been there from the beginning. Nobody had reported her missing. In the pre-DNA era of cold case investigation, an unidentified victim is essentially a wall. You can push against it with everything you have. You can accumulate 4,000 pages of documentation. You can broadcast her composite image to millions of television viewers. But if the people who knew her choose not to look for her, for whatever reason, the wall does not move. It would take the 21st century's most powerful forensic tool to finally crack it. Her name was Wanda Deann Kirkum. She was 18 years old. She was from Hornell, New York, a small city in the Steuben County region of upstate New York, a place shaped by cold winters, tight-knit communities, and the particular resilience of people who build their lives in smaller, quieter corners of America. Hornell sits in a narrow valley carved by the Canisteo River. Its history is tied to the railroad. It was a major hub for the Erie Railroad for much of the 20th century. It is the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where families have deep roots, and where the social fabric is tightly woven. Wanda had been born in Hornell, but details about her early childhood remain limited. What we know comes primarily from her cousin and closest living relative, Brenda Chartraw, who would later speak openly with the press after Wanda's identity was finally established in 2020. According to Chartraw, Wanda Kirkum's childhood was difficult. The specifics of those difficulties have not been widely publicized, but what is clear is that Wanda left home at 18 years old. She ran away. The decision to leave, to step off into the unknown with whatever you can carry, is never made lightly. People leave when staying has become more dangerous than the uncertainty of the road ahead. Wanda's parents did not report her missing. This fact is among the most heartbreaking in a story filled with heartbreak. Their daughter, their 18-year-old child, had vanished, and they did not pick up the phone. They did not call the police. They did not file a report. Both of Wanda's parents are now deceased. According to Brenda Chartraw, the family believed that Wanda had simply started a new life somewhere, that she had chosen to cut ties and disappear by choice. This acceptance, this willingness to believe that a young woman who had run away had simply relocated rather than come to harm, meant that Wanda Kirkum spent 29 years in a Florida social services vault, her name unknown, her story untold. It meant that the wall investigators kept pushing against had no opening, because no one on the other side was pushing back. What Wanda was doing in the weeks and months before her death remains largely unknown. Where she went when she left Hornell, how she made her way from upstate New York to the Florida Keys, these gaps in her story cannot be filled with certainty. The available evidence suggests she was traveling light, with minimal money and minimal possessions. Her clothing at the time of her death, the Forenza cardigan sweater and black moccasin booties, was better suited to a northern autumn or winter than to the subtropical warmth of the Keys. She may have been heading south in search of warmth and opportunity. She may have been drifting, the way young people without anchor points sometimes drift, following the sun and whatever circumstance presents itself. What we know is that at some point she arrived in Key West, and on the evening of February the 14th, 1991, she was trying to leave. She was heading north, maybe back toward home, maybe toward some other destination. Maybe she did not have a specific plan at all. Maybe north was just away, and away was all she needed. She had a heart tattoo on her left shoulder with the word love written inside it. She had a tiny cross with sun rays tattooed on the webbing near her left thumb. She had 4 piercings in each ear, with mismatched earrings that reflected her own personal style. She had perfect teeth, evidence that someone, at some point, had cared enough to take her to the dentist. She was 18 years old, and she deserved to make it. To understand Wanda Deann Kirkum's story, it helps to understand the place she came from. Hornell, New York sits in the southern tier region of upstate New York, approximately 70 miles south of Rochester and 50 miles north of the Pennsylvania border. It is a city of approximately 8,000 people, small enough that everyone knows the major families, large enough to have its own distinct identity and economic base. The city was founded in the early 19th century and grew rapidly during the railroad era. By the late 1800s, Hornell had become a major hub for the Erie Railroad, with rail yards, maintenance facilities, and a significant portion of the local economy tied directly to the railroad industry. Workers came from across the region to take jobs in the yards. Families built lives around the rhythm of shift work and union wages. The city had multiple hotels, shops, churches, schools, all the infrastructure of a small industrial city in its prime. By the time Wanda Deann Kirkum was born in Hornell in the early 1970s, the railroad era had largely passed. Like many small industrial cities across the American Northeast and Midwest, Hornell had experienced the economic disruptions of deindustrialization. The rail yards were still there, but they employed fewer people than they once had. The city had adapted, developing other industries and services, but the prosperity of the railroad era was a memory held by the older generation. The landscape around Hornell is characteristic of the southern tier: rolling hills, river valleys, a mix of small farms and patches of forest. The Canisteo River runs through the city, and the surrounding terrain is dotted with small communities connected by county roads and state highways. It is beautiful country, particularly in autumn when the leaves turn and the hills blaze with color. Winters are long and cold. Temperatures regularly drop below freezing from November through March, with substantial snowfall that blankets the region in white. This was Wanda's world in her earliest years. A small city surrounded by rural countryside. A place where people knew each other, where families had deep roots, where the social fabric was tightly woven. It was not a wealthy place, but it was a place where people looked out for each other, where communities took care of their own. Or at least, that was the ideal. The reality, as Wanda's story would show, could be much more complicated. The schools Wanda attended, in Pavilion, Batavia, and Oakfield, were in Genesee County, a region west of Hornell that shares the same general landscape and culture. These are small school districts, the kind where a graduating class might have 50 or 60 students, where everyone knows everyone else from kindergarten through senior year. The schools serve farming communities and small towns. The kids who grow up in these districts often stay in the region after graduation, going to work on family farms, taking jobs in local businesses, starting families of their own in the same communities where they grew up. But some leave. Some young people from these small communities look at the world beyond Genesee County and western New York and decide they want something different. They want cities. They want warmth. They want distance from family complications or small-town limitations. They want to reinvent themselves somewhere no one knows their history. For a young person in Pavilion or Oakfield in the late 1980s, that somewhere else might be New York City, might be California, might be Florida, any place that represented escape and possibility. For Wanda Kirkum, at 18 years old, that somewhere else was south. We do not know exactly what drew her to Florida, whether it was the promise of warm weather and beach communities, whether she knew someone there, whether she had a specific plan or was simply following the general southward migration that young people without resources sometimes take when winter closes in. What we know is that she left. She left Hornell, left Genesee County, left upstate New York with its cold winters and small towns. And she headed for the sun. For 29 years, the man who murdered Wanda Deann Kirkum had no name in the investigative files of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. He was the unknown subject, a ghost, a presence known only through the violence he left behind and the DNA preserved at the crime scene. His name was Robert Lynn Bradley. In 1991, when he killed Wanda Kirkum, he was 30 years old. Evidence suggests Bradley lived in Miami, Florida in late November of 1990, just a few months before Valentine's Day. The Florida Keys are directly connected to Miami by the Overseas Highway. If you live in Miami and you want to drive to Key West, you take US Route 1 South, the same road that connects the Keys to the mainland. Robert Lynn Bradley, living in Miami, was in the right geographic position to have been anywhere in the Keys on Valentine's Day, 1991. On the evening of February the 14th, 1991, Robert Lynn Bradley picked up a young woman who was hitchhiking near mile marker 17 on the overseas highway. Her name was Wanda Deann Kirkum. She was trying to get a ride north. He drove her nearly 20 miles in the opposite direction to a dirt road near mile marker 35 that led to an isolated area known as the Horseshoe. What happened on that dirt road is documented in the forensic evidence. Robert Lynn Bradley beat Wanda Deann Kirkum. He raped her, and then he strangled her with her own pink bikini top. He left her face down in the water, naked except for the ligature around her neck. He left her clothing scattered nearby, and then he walked away. The confidence with which Bradley committed this crime, the choice of location, the use of her clothing as a weapon, the apparent lack of panic or hesitation, suggests someone comfortable with violence. Whether Bradley had committed similar crimes before Wanda is a question that was never fully answered. What we do know is that Robert Lynn Bradley did not live long enough to face justice for what he did. 14 months after he murdered Wanda Kirkum in the Florida Keys, Robert Lynn Bradley himself became a murder victim. In April of 1992, Bradley's body was found in a ditch in northern Tarrant County, Texas, in an area called Westlake. He had been shot multiple times in the head. He was 31 years old at the time of his death. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported that Bradley was found lying in a ditch in the 2600 block of J.T. Ottinger Road, about a half-mile south of the Denan-Tarrant County line. Officials estimated he had been killed sometime Friday night or early Saturday morning. Shot multiple times in the head. Dumped in a ditch. The circumstances of Bradley's murder suggest execution-style killing, the kind of death that comes to people who move through violent circles and make violent enemies. The Tarrant County investigation into his death was its own separate case. There is no public record indicating it was ever solved. Crucially, however, Tarrant County investigators followed standard crime scene protocol. They collected DNA from their scene. They preserved evidence. They documented everything. And in doing so, they inadvertently preserved the key that would eventually unlock the Florida cold case. There is a grim symmetry to Robert Lynn Bradley's story. The man who left a young woman's body by a Florida roadside died himself by a Texas roadside 14 months later. That is not justice in any legal sense. No trial was held. No verdict was read. No sentence was handed down. But there is something in the arc of it that carries its own kind of dark poetry. Cold cases are not static. They do not simply sit in a filing cabinet gathering dust. The best cold cases, the ones that eventually get solved, are kept alive by a combination of factors: dedicated investigators who return to the file regularly, technological advances that periodically offer new tools, and the sometimes unpredictable ways in which the world changes around a frozen case. The Valentine Jane Doe case was one of the best-worked cold cases in Monroe County Sheriff's Office history. The 4,000 pages of documentation speak to that. But documentation without answers is a record of effort, not success. Year after year through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the case remained open and unsolved. The development of CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, in the late 1980s and through the 90s transformed cold case investigation in America. For the first time, DNA profiles from crime scenes could be stored in a national database and systematically compared against DNA collected from convicted offenders. Cases that had been frozen for years began to crack open. But in the Valentine Jane Doe case, CODIS offered no match. Robert Lynn Bradley was never arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. He never entered the system through the standard pathway. And Wanda Kirkum, never reported missing, with no government record connecting her DNA to her name, had no entry point that would allow for a match. The case was entered into the FBI's VALENTINE'S database, which cross-references violent crimes nationally. The NAMUS database, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, also carried the case. NAMUS was specifically designed to cross-reference unidentified remains against missing persons reports. Valentine Jane Doe was in NAMUS. But because no one had ever reported Wanda Kirkum missing, there was no report to match against. By the time the 2010s arrived, the Valentine Jane Doe case had been open for more than 2 decades. The detectives who had worked it in the early years were retired or moved on. A new generation of investigators had inherited the file. The physical evidence, including the DNA samples, had been preserved with care, held in expectation of the day when technology would exist to use them more effectively. That day was coming. To fully appreciate the breakthrough that solved the Valentine Jane Doe case, it is important to understand the evolution of DNA databases and their application in law enforcement. The story of DNA in criminal justice is essentially the story of how a scientific discovery in molecular biology became, over the course of several decades, one of the most powerful investigative tools ever developed. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the molecule that carries genetic information in all living organisms. Every human being has a unique DNA sequence, with the exception of identical twins, who share the same DNA. This uniqueness is what makes DNA so valuable for identification purposes. If you can extract DNA from biological material left at a crime scene, blood, saliva, semen, skin cells, hair roots, you can create a DNA profile, essentially a genetic fingerprint of the person who left that material. The first use of DNA evidence in a criminal case occurred in England in 1986, when DNA profiling helped both exonerate one suspect and identify the actual perpetrator in a double murder case. The technology quickly spread to the United States, where forensic laboratories began developing the capability to process DNA evidence. By the late 1980s, DNA evidence was being introduced in American courtrooms, though its admissibility and the protocols for collecting and analyzing it were still being established through case law and scientific consensus. The creation of CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was the next major advance. CODIS is a database that stores DNA profiles from multiple sources: convicted offenders, arrestees in some jurisdictions, DNA from unsolved crime scenes, and DNA from unidentified human remains. The FBI began developing CODIS in the late 1980s and rolled it out nationally in the 1990s. The system allows investigators to compare a DNA profile from a crime scene against profiles already in the database, potentially identifying a suspect who has been convicted of another crime. CODIS revolutionized cold case investigation. Cases that had been unsolvable because no suspect had been identified could suddenly be cracked if the perpetrator was later arrested and convicted for a different crime. As states began requiring DNA collection from convicted offenders, first for violent crimes, then for broader categories of offenses, the CODIS database grew larger and more powerful. By the 2000s, CODIS contained millions of profiles and was generating thousands of hits per year, connecting criminals to crimes they thought they had gotten away with decades earlier. But CODIS had limitations. The most significant was that it could only identify people who were already in the system. If a perpetrator had never been arrested or convicted for a qualifying crime, they would not be in CODIS, and a comparison of crime scene DNA against the database would yield no match. This limitation meant that CODIS, despite its power, could not solve every case. Some perpetrators had simply never entered the criminal justice system in a way that required DNA collection. This is where investigative genetic genealogy entered the picture. The consumer DNA testing revolution of the 2000s and 2010s created vast databases of genetic information from ordinary people. Companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe marketed their services to people interested in learning about their ethnic heritage, finding distant relatives, and exploring their family trees. Millions of people sent in saliva samples, received reports about their ancestry, and uploaded their data to platforms like GeneMatch, where they could compare results with other users. The breakthrough insight was that these genealogy databases could be used for law enforcement purposes. If you had DNA from a crime scene or from unidentified remains, you could upload that profile to a genealogy database and find relatives of the person you were looking for, even distant relatives like third or fourth cousins. From those relatives, you could build family trees using traditional genealogical research: birth records, marriage records, census data, obituaries. You could work backward through generations to find common ancestors, then work forward through other branches of the tree to identify specific individuals who match the known characteristics of your suspect or victim. The technique requires significant skill and patience. A fourth cousin might share less than 1% of DNA with the person you are looking for. building a family tree from that distant connection back to common ancestors who might have lived in the 1700s, then forward again through multiple branches to find the right individual in the present day, is complex work. It requires access to genealogical databases, knowledge of how to interpret DNA match data, and the ability to work through ambiguous or incomplete family records. But when done correctly, the technique works. The Golden State Killer case in 2018 proved that. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo after a 40-year investigation, based entirely on genetic genealogy matches to distant relatives, demonstrated that this technique could solve cases that had defeated every other investigative approach. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice. Cold case units began learning the technique. Protocols were developed. Privacy concerns were debated. And case after case began to crack open. The Valentine Jane Doe case would eventually become one of those successes. But it would take until 2020 for the technology to be applied, for the genealogical research to be completed, and for the answers to finally emerge from data that had been sitting in storage since 1991. To understand how the Valentine Jane Doe case was ultimately solved, you need to understand the revolution that took place in forensic DNA science in the second decade of the 21st century. The technique is called investigative genetic genealogy, and it changed everything. For decades, forensic DNA work in law enforcement relied primarily on codies. When you collect DNA from a crime scene, you run it against codies and hope for a match with an offender already in the database. The system works well. Codies has helped solve hundreds of thousands of cases, but it has a fundamental limitation. If the person whose DNA you have collected has never been convicted of a qualifying crime, they will not be in codies, and you will get no match. The genealogy revolution began with the consumer DNA testing industry. In the 2000s, and especially the early 2010s, companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe began offering affordable DNA testing. For less than $100, anyone could send in a saliva sample and receive a report about their ethnic ancestry and, crucially, connect with other people who shared genetic material. Suddenly, millions of ordinary people were uploading their DNA to public databases. GEDmatch was created as an open-source platform where people could upload DNA data from any commercial testing company. It became a massive repository of genetic information, populated by people who had taken commercial DNA tests and wanted to compare results. The investigative insight that changed everything was this. If you have DNA from a crime scene or from unidentified remains, and you upload that DNA profile to a public genealogy database, you can sometimes find not the person you are looking for, but their relatives, even distant relatives, even fourth cousins. And from those distant relatives, using traditional genealogical research, building family trees backward through generations and then forward again, you can sometimes identify a specific individual. This technique exploded into public consciousness in April 2018, when California law enforcement announced the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. After nearly 40 years of investigation, DeAngelo had been identified through investigative genetic genealogy. His DNA from a crime scene had been uploaded to GEDmatch. Matches to distant relatives had been found, family trees had been built, and investigators had narrowed the field to DeAngelo. The Golden State Killer arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Suddenly, cases that had been frozen for decades had a new pathway to solution. The technique spread quickly. Within months, cold case units across the country were learning investigative genetic genealogy and applying it to their oldest, most stubborn files. The Valentine Jane Doe case had two separate DNA questions to answer: the identity of the victim and the identity of the killer. Both questions would eventually be answered using this new technology. Within the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, the Valentine Jane Doe case had a champion in Detective Vince Weiner of the Major Crimes Unit. Weiner understood that the case was not closed just because it was cold, that the obligation to the victim did not have an expiration date, and that the evolution of technology meant the evidence preserved decades ago might finally give answers. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the FDLE, is Florida's statewide law enforcement agency, with resources and technical capabilities that supplement local agencies. The FDLE operates a sophisticated crime laboratory system, and as investigative genetic genealogy became an accepted tool in the late 2010s, The FDLE was at the forefront of developing protocols for its use in Florida cold cases. Detective Weiner and the FDLE formed a partnership specifically focused on the Valentine Jane Doe case. Monroe County Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit Detective Vince Weiner and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement partnered using advanced DNA technology, which assisted in identifying both Kirkum and her killer. The process for identifying the victim involved uploading her DNA profile to a genealogy database. The technique was straightforward in concept. Find any DNA matches, even distant ones, and use genealogical research to work toward the specific individual whose remains had been lying in a Florida vault for nearly 3 decades. The upload produced matches. From those matches, investigators worked methodically through family trees. They identified relationships, traced branches, narrowed the field. The goal was to find someone whose profile matched what was known about Valentine Jane Doe, a young woman, approximately 18 to 20 years old, from the northeastern United States, who had gone missing in early 1991 without being reported. The genealogical work led investigators to a family member whose DNA could be directly compared. A sample was obtained. The comparison was made. The match was confirmed. Valentine Jane Doe was Wanda Deann Kirkum, 18 years old, of Hornell, New York. 29 years of anonymity, ended by science. But the work was not done. The second question, who killed her, still needed an answer. Here is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The DNA collected from the Florida Keys crime scene in February 1991 had to be compared against something. Investigators ran it through available databases. And then they discovered a connection no one had anticipated. In Tarrant County, Texas, the crime scene from the April 1992 murder of Robert Lynn Bradley, the man found shot multiple times in the head in a ditch on J.T. Ottinger Road, had been processed and DNA had been collected. When the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's crime laboratory compared the DNA from the Valentine Jane Doe crime scene against the DNA from Bradley's murder scene in Tarrant County, Texas, the result was definitive. Bradley's DNA was obtained from the 1991 crime scene in the Florida Keys, and that DNA, as well as DNA from his own homicide scene, were recently compared at the FDLE crime lab and determined to be a match. The DNA of Wanda Kirkum's killer matched the DNA of Robert Lynn Bradley. The same person had been present at both scenes. The connection between a young woman's murder in the Florida Keys and a man's murder in northern Tarrant County, separated by 14 months and 1,000 miles, was written in DNA. Robert Lynn Bradley had murdered Wanda Deann Kirkum, and someone else had murdered Robert Lynn Bradley. On Monday, June the 15th, 2020, Monroe County Sheriff Rick Ramsey stood before the cameras and made the announcement the community had waited nearly 30 years to hear. I would like to personally thank Major Crimes Unit Detective Vince Weiner and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for their efforts in solving this very serious and tragic crime. This case is a testament and shining example of this agency's commitment to solving crime, no matter how old the case and no matter the challenges. The words were measured and professional, but within them was something more. 29 years of effort. 29 years of detectives waking up in the middle of the night wondering if they had missed something. 29 years of a dispatcher who carried the case in her memory. 29 years of a young woman's remains waiting for someone to say her name. Valentine Jane Doe was Wanda Deann Kirkum, 18 years old, of Hornell, New York. Her killer was Robert Lynn Bradley, 30 years old at the time of her murder, who had himself been murdered in Texas at age 31, 14 months after killing Wanda. Sheriff Ramsey stated that with the victim and suspect identities known, the sheriff's office is formally considering the Valentine Jane Doe homicide resolved and closed. Charges will not be filed because Bradley is dead. After nearly 30 years, Kirkum's story has been told and her name has not been forgotten. The news reverberated across the country. In upstate New York, in Hornell where Wanda was born, people connected the name in the news with a young woman who had left home at 18 and never come back. In one particular household, a woman named Brenda Chartraw heard a name she had not heard spoken in many years, Wanda Deann Kirkum. Her cousin, the girl who had run away and, as the family had believed, started a new life somewhere. Only she had not. When Monroe County Sheriff Rick Ramsey announced on June the 15th 2020 that Valentine Jane Doe had been identified as Wanda Deann Kirkum of Hornell, New York, and that her killer had been identified as Robert Lynn Bradley. The resolution sent ripples through multiple communities: law enforcement, the cold case advocacy world, the true crime media ecosystem, and most importantly, the family and community that had never known what happened to Wanda. For the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, the resolution represented vindication of decades of effort. The 4,000 pages of documentation, the preserved DNA samples, the refusal to let the case be forgotten, all of that had mattered. Lieutenant Manuel Cuervo, who had spoken publicly about losing sleep over the case, could finally rest knowing the question had been answered. Detective Vince Weiner, who had partnered with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to apply the new genetic genealogy techniques, had achieved what an earlier generation of investigators could not because they were better investigators, but because they had better tools. The case also represented validation of the decision to invest in DNA technology and genetic genealogy capabilities. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement had made significant investments in developing the capacity to do this kind of work. Other states were watching to see whether the technique really worked in practice. The successful resolution of the Valentine Jane Doe case, with both victim and perpetrator identified through DNA, demonstrated that the technique was viable and worth the investment. It provided a template that other agencies could follow in working their own cold cases. For the genetic genealogy field itself, the Valentine Jane Doe case was significant because it demonstrated the dual application of the technique, using it to identify both an unknown victim and an unknown perpetrator in the same case. Most high-profile genetic genealogy successes had focused on one or the other, identifying a perpetrator like the Golden State Killer or identifying unknown remains. The Valentine Jane Doe case required both identifications and achieved both, showing the full power of the technique when properly applied. The true crime media community, which had covered the Valentine Jane Doe case for years, finally had the resolution it had been hoping for. Podcasts that had covered the case could produce follow-up episodes. True crime YouTube channels could create videos explaining how it was solved. The web sleuths community, which had maintained an active thread on the case, could finally mark it resolved. The resolution also served as a reminder of why media coverage of cold cases matters. Keeping cases in the public consciousness increases the pressure on law enforcement to keep working them, and occasionally generates the tip that breaks them open. But the most significant impact was personal. For Brenda Chartraw and the Kirkum family, the resolution meant the end of 29 years of not knowing. The family had believed Wanda had started a new life somewhere and chosen not to stay in contact. Learning the truth, that she had been murdered on Valentine's Day, 1991, was devastating. But it was also, in a sense, a relief. Not knowing is its own kind of torture. The human mind needs narrative closure. We need to know what happened. Without that knowledge, we exist in a state of suspended uncertainty that prevents genuine grieving. The announcement in June 2020 gave the Kirkum family the closure they needed to finally mourn properly. The resolution also allowed Wanda to come home. Her ashes had been held by Florida Social Services for 29 years, unclaimed because no one knew who she was. With her identity established and her family located, Wanda could finally be given a proper burial. The headstone donated by Oakley Monuments in Batavia meant she would have a permanent marker with her real name, not Jane Doe, but Wanda Deann Kirkum. That name, carved in stone, represented a reclaiming of identity that death and time and circumstance had taken from her. The case resolution also brought attention to the broader issues the Valentine Jane Doe case illuminated. The vulnerability of young people fleeing difficult home situations, the gaps in missing persons reporting, the challenges of protecting transient populations, and the importance of preserving evidence even when cases seem unsolvable. These are systemic issues without easy solutions, but awareness is the first step toward addressing them. Wanda Kirkum's story, now told in full, serves as a case study in what can go wrong when multiple systems fail simultaneously. For law enforcement agencies nationwide working their own cold cases, the Valentine Jane Doe resolution was both inspiring and instructive. It demonstrated that cases can be solved decades later if evidence is properly preserved. It showed that new technologies can crack cases that defeated older methods. It proved that keeping cases active, maintaining the documentation, checking new databases, applying new techniques as they become available, can eventually pay off. And it reminded investigators that the obligation to victims does not have an expiration date. One of the most profound aspects of the Valentine Jane Doe case is what it teaches us about the human need to name the dead. For 29 years, Wanda Deann Kirkum was known only as Valentine Jane Doe, a placeholder name assigned by the systems that process unidentified remains. But a placeholder is not a real name. It carries no history, no family connection, no personal meaning. Understanding why identification matters, why it was so important to put Wanda's real name back on her story, requires thinking about what names mean and what they do. Names are how we assert identity. They are how we distinguish one person from another, how we claim membership in families and communities, how we mark our presence in the world. When someone dies with their name known, their death becomes part of a larger story, the story of their family, their community, their life. When someone dies without a name, they become a mystery, a question mark, a blank space where a person used to be. They exist in records, but not in memory. They are counted, but not mourned. The choice of Jane Doe as a placeholder for unidentified women and John Doe for men is revealing in itself. The name comes from legal practice. It is the name used in court documents when the real name of a party is unknown or being withheld. It is a technical designation, not a human one. It serves a bureaucratic function, allowing paperwork to proceed even when identity is uncertain. But it is not a memorial. It is not a remembrance. It is a placeholder in the most literal sense, holding the place where a real name should be. For families of missing persons who are later identified as Jane or John Does, learning the true identity of their loved one is often described in terms of finally being able to grieve. Without certainty about what happened, families exist in a liminal state, not quite bereaved because they do not know for certain their loved one is dead, but not quite hopeful because they fear the worst. When identification is made, that liminal state ends. The uncertainty is replaced by terrible certainty, but at least it is certainty. The grieving process can finally begin. For the broader community, naming the dead is an act of respect and recognition. It says, this person mattered. This person was not just a statistic or a case number. This person had a name, had a family, had a life that meant something. When Wanda Deann Kirkum was finally identified, people in Hornell and Genesee County who had known her as a child could finally understand what had happened to the girl who had left and never come back. Her classmates could remember her. Her community could claim her. Her cousin Brenda could tell her story. The act of identification also serves a kind of historical justice. When someone is murdered and remains unidentified, the perpetrator has succeeded not only in taking their life, but in erasing their identity. They are reduced to physical evidence and forensic measurements. But when identification is achieved, especially decades later, that erasure is reversed. The victim's name is restored. Their story is told. The person who tried to make them disappear has failed. This is not legal justice, especially in cases like this, where the perpetrator is already dead, but it is a kind of justice nonetheless. There is also a practical dimension to identification. Unidentified remains place burdens on the systems that process them. Medical examiners must store them indefinitely. Social services must maintain records. Law enforcement must keep the case active. When identification is made, some of those burdens can be resolved. The remains can be released to family. Resources can be redirected to other cases. The bureaucratic apparatus surrounding the unidentified person can be closed out, allowing everyone involved to move forward. But beyond the practical, and even beyond the emotional, there is something deeply human about the need to name the dead. It is part of how we process mortality, how we honor those who have passed, how we maintain continuity between the living and the dead. Every culture on Earth has naming practices for the dead: funerals, memorials, gravestones, death notices. These practices serve psychological and social functions that are fundamental to human communities. When someone dies without a name, those functions cannot be properly performed. The social and psychological work of grieving is incomplete. The Valentine Jane Doe case, now resolved, allows all of that work to finally be done. Wanda Deann Kirkum has her name back. Her family can grieve her properly. Her community can remember her. The systems that held her remains can release them. And everyone who worked her case for 29 years can know that they succeeded in the most fundamental task of all. They gave her back her name. That name, Wanda Deann Kirkum, now stands as permanent testament to a young woman who deserved better than what the world gave her, and who finally received at least this small measure of justice. To be known, to be named, to be remembered. Brenda Chartraw was Wanda Kirkum's first cousin. She was one of the closest living relatives Wanda had left in the world. Both of Wanda's parents were deceased. The family structure that had surrounded Wanda in her childhood had dispersed over the years. Brenda Chartraw remembered her cousin. She remembered Wanda as a person, not as a case file, not as a composite drawing, not as a Jane Doe, but as a living, specific human being who had mattered. For 29 years, the family had believed Wanda was out there somewhere. According to Chartraw, the family thought Wanda had chosen her disappearance, that she had started a new life. They had accepted that explanation and moved on. The news from Florida changed everything. Wanda had not been living a quiet life somewhere. She had been dead since Valentine's Day, 1991. She had been in a Florida vault for 29 years, her ashes unclaimed, her name unknown. The first thing Brenda Chartraw wanted to do was bring Wanda home. The Florida Social Services Office worked with the family to return Wanda's remains. The ashes were transferred to Brenda Chartraw, and Chartraw began the work of giving her cousin the proper burial she had never had. The burial would take place at a cemetery in Oakfield, one of the communities near where Wanda had lived. Oakfield is a quiet village in western New York, surrounded by fields and farms. It was part of Wanda's world. It would be her final resting place. The headstone for Wanda's grave was donated by Oakley Monuments of Batavia, a local business that decided to give something back to a young woman who had been one of their own. The gesture was a reminder that even in cold cases, the human community responds with compassion when the truth comes out. Brenda Chartraw organized fundraising efforts to help with the costs of the burial and memorial. She brought the community together around the task of giving Wanda a proper farewell. The response was warm and generous, the kind of response that reminds us why local communities matter. Chartraw spoke publicly about her cousin's life and death, about the circumstances that had led an 18-year-old girl to run away from home and end up alone on a Florida highway. She wanted people to understand not just that Wanda had been murdered, but who Wanda had been before that night, a young woman who had been trying to find her way in the world with the limited resources available to her. Wanda Deann Kirkum finally had her name back. She finally had someone to claim her, and she finally had a place to rest. The Valentine Jane Doe case is remarkable because it used investigative genetic genealogy to solve two separate identification challenges simultaneously: identifying the victim and identifying the killer. Most applications of investigative genetic genealogy in cold cases focus on identifying perpetrators. The Golden State Killer case was about identifying the killer. Most high-profile cold case breaks that followed were about perpetrators. But Wanda Kirkum's case presented both challenges at once. The victim had no name, and neither did the killer. This made the Monroe County case doubly complex and doubly significant. The case also illuminated a phenomenon that law enforcement and advocates have long recognized: the problem of individuals who are never reported missing. The United States has NAMA specifically designed to cross-reference unidentified remains against missing persons reports. But the system can only work when missing persons are actually reported. When families choose not to report, when systems fail vulnerable young people, NAMAs and CODIs cannot help. The Doe Network estimates that there are thousands of unidentified individuals in medical examiners' offices across the United States at any given time. Many of them were never reported missing. They fell off the grid because they had already been living on the margins: young people from troubled homes, individuals experiencing homelessness, victims who had cut ties with their families, people whose social networks were too fragile to sound the alarm when they disappeared. Wanda Kirkum's story is also a story about vulnerability. She ran from home at 18, the earliest age when running could be legally unencumbered. She ran without money, without resources, without a clear destination, into a world that was indifferent at best and predatory at worst. The circumstances that left her hitchhiking alone on a Florida highway created the vulnerability that Robert Lynn Bradley exploited. Understanding that trajectory does not reduce Bradley's moral responsibility. Bradley made his choices. He chose violence. He chose murder. The responsibility for Wanda's death belongs entirely to him. But understanding the full arc of her life is essential to understanding how a young woman could die in February 1991 and not be identified for 29 years. The advances in investigative genetic genealogy that solved this case have continued to accelerate. By the early 2020s, the technique had helped solve hundreds of cases. The Department of Justice issued guidelines in 2019 restricting the use of genetic genealogy to violent crimes and identifying unidentified remains, both of which applied to the Valentine Jane Doe case. The ethical dimensions of investigative genetic genealogy remain an active area of debate. Privacy advocates have raised concerns about the use of consumer DNA databases by law enforcement. These concerns deserve serious engagement. But the cases that the technique has solved represent a compelling argument for its judicious use. Cold cases that were once effectively unsolvable are being solved. Victims who were once unidentifiable are being named. Families are receiving answers. The stretch of U.S. Route 1 between Big Pine Key and Bahia Honda Key looks much the same today as it did in February 1991. The overseas highway remains a marvel of engineering, a road that runs on bridges and causeways above water for much of its length, connecting a scattered chain of islands. Big Pine Key is home to the National Key Deer Refuge, a protected area that shelters the key deer, a subspecies of white-tailed deer found nowhere else on Earth. The island has a quiet, residential character. Bahia Honda Key is home to Bahia Honda State Park, one of the most beautiful state parks in Florida. The park draws visitors from across the country who come to swim, snorkel, and camp on the rare Atlantic side beach. Between these two islands, near mile marker 35, the dirt road that leads to the Horseshoe has been there for decades. Locals know it. Windsurfers use the area. On the morning of February the 15th, 1991, it was along that road that windsurfers found Wanda Deann Kirkum. Nothing marks the spot today. There is no memorial, no marker, no indication to passing drivers that this stretch of road carries weight. The keys move on. The tourists come and go. The water glitters in the sun. But the case is closed now, and Wanda Kirkum has been brought home to a cemetery in Oakfield, New York, with a donated headstone that carries her name. Not Jane Doe. Her name. Her actual name. Wanda Deann Kirkum, 18 years old. From Hornell, New York. Killed in the Florida Keys on Valentine's Day, 1991. Identified 29 years later by DNA and the persistence of people who refuse to let her remain unnamed. The Valentine Jane Doe case teaches us several things about modern cold case investigation. It teaches us about the power of technology, the value of evidence preservation, the importance of institutional memory, and the human factors that complicate even the most sophisticated investigation. First, it is a case study in evidence preservation. The DNA samples collected at the Florida Keys crime scene in February 1991 were preserved for 29 years. This required deliberate choice at every stage. When evidence is collected at a crime scene, it enters a chain of custody that must be maintained without break. The people responsible for that evidence all played a role in making the DNA comparison possible. Had those samples been destroyed, lost, or degraded, no amount of technological advancement would have helped. The DNA from Bradley's murder scene in Texas was similarly crucial and similarly had to have been preserved. Second, the case illustrates the importance of cross-jurisdictional information sharing. The connection between the Florida Keys crime scene and the Tarrant County, Texas crime scene was not obvious. The two cases happened in different states, under different agencies, separated by 14 months. The connection was made possible by the FDLE Crime Lab's ability to compare databases across jurisdictional lines. Third, the case shows the evolving importance of investigative genetic genealogy. The technique entered mainstream law enforcement use only since 2018. But its application in the Valentine Jane Doe case demonstrates that it works in individual homicide cold cases involving unidentified victims from vulnerable populations. Fourth, the case highlights gaps in social systems. Wanda Kirkum fell through multiple gaps. The gap that allowed her to leave home without protective intervention. The gap in the missing persons reporting system that allowed her disappearance to go officially unnoticed. The gap that meant her name was unknown for nearly 3 decades. Each of these gaps exists because the systems involved depend on other people to activate them. For young people fleeing situations, the isolation that follows their escape can be the most dangerous thing about it. When something happens to them, there is no one to sound the alarm. This points to the need for more robust systems for identifying and following up with at-risk youth. The case also offers reflection on what justice means when the perpetrator is already dead. Robert Lynn Bradley cannot be arrested, charged, tried, convicted, or sentenced. He died in April 1992, before the investigation could identify him. The formal mechanisms of criminal justice are unavailable, and yet the Monroe County Sheriff's Office declared the case resolved and closed. Because resolution and justice are not always the same thing. Resolution is knowing what happened. It is being able to say her name. It is being able to give her ashes back to her family. It is being able to put a headstone with her name on it. After 29 years, the Valentine Jane Doe case achieved that resolution. In true crime, there is a risk that victims become defined entirely by their deaths. They become the case. They become the Jane Doe. The details that made them human get buried under the weight of the investigation. Wanda Deann Kirkum deserves better. She deserves to be remembered as a person. What we know about Wanda comes from the few accounts of her life. Her cousin Brenda Chartreau remembered her. Whatever the dysfunction of Wanda's immediate family, the connection between cousins was real. She got tattoos. The heart with love on her left shoulder. The cross with sun raised near her left thumb. These were not accidental. She had decorated her body with symbols of love and light. She had 4 piercings in each ear, with mismatched earrings, an eclectic, personal style that spoke to someone who curated her own look. She had perfect teeth. Someone had taken her to a dentist regularly. Whatever the failures in other areas, there were periods when Wanda received at least some basic care. She ran away at 18. This is an act of courage. Leaving is never easy. For an 18-year-old with no money and no plan, choosing to leave rather than stay is choosing the unknown over known harm. It is self-determination. It is refusal to accept that this is all life is. It is hope. She had a heart tattoo with the word love in it. She was heading north. She was 18 years old on Valentine's Day, 1991, and she was looking for something better. That is who Wanda Deann Kirkum was. Not just a victim. Not just a case. A young woman with tattoos she chose, with mismatched earrings that matched her personality, with a road ahead of her that she was determined to walk. She is buried in Oakfield, New York. Her name is on a headstone. Her cousin knows where she is. The case is closed. Rest in peace, Wanda Deann Kirkum. No cold case is solved by a single person. The Valentine Jane Doe investigation stretched across nearly 3 decades, touched dozens of investigators, and required the sustained institutional commitment of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. Detective Vince Weiner of the Monroe County Sheriff's Major Crimes Unit is the most prominently named investigator in the resolution. His partnership with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and his decision to apply investigative genetic genealogy to the file was the direct catalyst for the breakthrough. But Weiner did not work alone. His work was only possible because others had maintained the evidence and kept the case alive. The dispatcher who took the first call on February the 15th, 1991, kept the case top of mind within the sheriff's office for decades. That kind of persistent human advocacy within an institution is one of the reasons this case survived long enough for DNA technology to solve it. Lieutenant Manuel Cuervo, who spoke publicly about the case and whose comments about waking in the middle of the night capture the emotional weight of unsolved cases, represents the generation of detectives who carried this file through the years. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, whose crime laboratory did the critical work of developing and applying the DNA techniques, deserves recognition for the investment in scientific capability that makes this work possible. Sheriff Rick Ramsey, who made the announcement in June 2020, spoke with evident pride. Countless investigative hours have been poured into trying to solve this crime. Now, with the victim and suspect identities known, the sheriff's office is formally considering the Valentine Jane Doe homicide resolved and closed. Resolved and closed. 2 words that represent 30 years of work and the dignity of a proper ending. The Valentine Jane Doe case has a particular relationship with true crime media that is worth exploring. It came of age in the era when true crime television was transforming from occasional specials into a full genre, a genre that has since expanded into podcasts, YouTube channels, and streaming series. Unsolved Mysteries pioneered the combination of dramatic reenactment and direct appeals to the audience that has become the standard template for true crime programming. The show's power to generate tips was real. The hundreds of calls after the Valentine Jane Doe segment were each a human being who thought they recognized someone. Crime Watch Daily, which revisited the case in 2016 with Lieutenant Cuervo, represented the next generation, more contemporary in format, more focused on current developments. True crime YouTube channels like Buried Secret Media represent the democratization of investigative journalism. They allow cases to reach audiences who might never have seen broadcast television and provide the kind of nuanced, long-form treatment that limited-format news programs cannot. The amateur true crime community, online forums, web sleuths, Reddit communities, also plays an increasingly recognized role. The web sleuths community maintained an active thread on the Valentine Jane Doe case for years, preserving institutional knowledge and keeping public interest alive. There is an important ethical dimension every content creator and consumer should keep in mind. The people at the center of these stories are real. Their families are real. Their pain is real. The obligation to treat them with dignity, to tell their stories accurately, to foreground their humanity, to support rather than undermine investigation, is not optional. In Wanda Kirkum's case, responsible coverage means ensuring her story is told as a whole, not just as a crime, but as a life. It means naming the perpetrator accurately, without gratuitous focus. It means respecting her family's grief. It means saying her name, Wanda Deann Kirkum, not Valentine Jane Doe. Her name. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office officially resolved and closed the Valentine Jane Doe homicide on June 15, 2020. Victim identified, Wanda Deann Kirkum. Killer identified, Robert Lynn Bradley. Case resolved. With Bradley murdered in April 1992, there is no living perpetrator to prosecute. There is no trial, no prosecutor, no jury, no sentence. The formal mechanisms of criminal justice are unavailable. And so the case sits in that particular category. Solved but unprosecuted, answered but not adjudicated. What remains unresolved is the broader arc of Robert Lynn Bradley's story. Who killed him? Why? The Tarrant County investigation into his murder was its own separate case, and the public record does not indicate it was ever solved. A man shot multiple times in the head and dumped in a ditch is typically the product of criminal enterprise. But without a solved case in Texas, we do not know why Bradley was killed or by whom. There is also the question of whether Bradley committed similar crimes. The systematic nature of his crime against Wanda suggests someone who had, at minimum, thought carefully about how to commit such a crime. Whether that thinking was theoretical or based on prior experience is unknown. Bradley spent 14 months alive after Wanda's death before his own killing, a window in which he could have committed additional crimes. For Brenda Chartraw and Wanda's family, the case's closure brought peace even within grief. The not knowing, the decades of wondering whether Wanda was alive somewhere, was replaced by clarity of truth, however painful. Truth is the precondition for genuine grieving. For the Kirkum family, 2020 was the year they could finally mourn. Wanda's grave in Oakfield, with the donated headstone, is a fixed point now. A place where her name is carved in stone. A place her cousin can visit. A place that says, she existed. She mattered. The Valentine Jane Doe case is one of thousands of cold cases being revisited by law enforcement in the era of investigative genetic genealogy. The technology that identified Wanda Kirkum is being applied to cases that have waited decades. The Department of Justice estimates approximately 240,000 open, unsolved homicide cases in the United States. Each represents a victim. Each victim represents a family waiting for an answer. The accumulation of that waiting is a social reality the criminal justice system has an obligation to address. Investigative genetic genealogy is not the only tool being deployed. Advances in touch DNA technology have expanded the range of evidence that can be profiled. Advances in facial reconstruction from DNA allow investigators to generate approximate visual descriptions from genetic material. Digital forensics has become increasingly important. State-level cold case units have been established or expanded. Florida's FDLE, which played a central role in the Valentine Jane Doe resolution, is one of the better-resourced state agencies. Federal resources through the FBI and Department of Justice supplement state and local capacity. But resources are always finite. Cold cases compete for time and budget against current cases. The challenge is always resource allocation. How do you justify spending on a case from decades ago when current crimes demand attention? The answer most serious cold case investigators give is that justice does not have a statute of limitations on murder, that the obligation to victims does not expire. The Valentine Jane Doe case supports that argument powerfully. 29 years. 4,000 pages of documentation. Every tool of every era applied. And then, when the right technology arrived, the case broke open in months. Other cases are waiting for their moment. Other Wandas are waiting to be named. It is Valentine's Day in the Florida Keys. There are hearts in the shop windows. There are couples walking along the overseas highway. The sea is turquoise glass. The sky is pale winter blue that makes you understand why people travel this far south. Somewhere in this beautiful corridor, on a Valentine's Day 33 years ago, an 18-year-old girl from Hornell, New York was standing on the shoulder of this road, trying to get somewhere. She had a heart tattoo with the word love on her left shoulder. She had survived things most people never have to survive. She was moving, which meant she had not given up. That is what she had. Movement. The willingness to keep going even when the road is uncertain. The heart tattoo. The word love. A young woman choosing to mark her body with the thing she most needed, the thing most absent from her life, but that she was still reaching for, still believing in enough to have it permanently inked into her skin. This is what the Valentine Jane Doe case ultimately teaches us. Not just about DNA, not just about cold case investigation, but about the young woman herself. Wanda Deann Kirkum survived enormous harm, found the courage to leave, and set out looking for something better. The fact that something monstrous intercepted her is the tragedy. The fact that we finally know her name, that science and persistence finally prevailed, is the smallest possible justice. It is not enough. It can never be enough. Nothing replaces the life Wanda Kirkum did not get to live. Nothing fills in the children she might have had, the friendships she might have formed, the places she might have seen, the love she might have found. But it is something. It is a name on a headstone in Oakfield, New York. It is a cousin who can visit. It is a community that gathered to say, she was one of ours, and we remember her. It is the word love, permanently marked on a shoulder that the Florida sun never got to tan. Wanda Deann Kirkum. Say her name. She was 18 years old. She had a whole life ahead of her, and she deserved every single year of it. If this documentary moved you, if Wanda's story reached you the way it reached us, please take 30 seconds right now and do 3 things. First, hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm that Wanda's story matters. It helps us reach more people who need to hear it. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. Second, leave a comment. Say her name in the comments below. Write Wanda Deann Kirkum and let her name fill this space. Let every person who watches this video see that she is remembered, that she is named, that she is not forgotten. Her name was Wanda Deann Kirkum. Third, subscribe to Buried Secret Media and hit the notification bell. We do this work because we believe that no cold case should stay cold forever. We believe that every victim deserves to be named. We believe that the stories that happen in the dark deserve to be told in the light. If you believe that too, subscribe. Join our community. Be part of this. We will see you in the next documentary. Until then, say their names. Remember their stories. And never stop looking for the truth. This has been Buried Secret Media. The resolution of the Valentine Jane Doe case in June of 2020 came at a particular moment in American history. The country was in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Protests over police violence and racial justice were filling streets across the nation. The news cycle was dominated by crisis after crisis. And yet, when Monroe County Sheriff Rick Ramsey announced that a 29-year-old cold case had finally been solved, that a young woman who had been nameless for nearly 3 decades now had her identity back, people paid attention. They paid attention because Wanda Deann Kirkum's story touched something fundamental about our need for justice, for closure, for the dead to be properly named and remembered. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing a cold case solved. It is not the same as seeing a current case prosecuted. There is no courtroom drama, no jury deliberation, no sentence handed down. Robert Lynn Bradley was already dead. He would never stand trial for what he did to Wanda Kirkum. He would never face a judge or a prosecutor or Wanda's family. The formal mechanisms of criminal justice could not touch him. And yet the resolution felt like justice of a kind, because it meant that Bradley's attempt to make Wanda disappear had ultimately failed. She had been found. She had been named. Her story had been told. That is not nothing. The case also reminds us that forensic science continues to evolve in ways that were unimaginable even a generation ago. In 1991, when Wanda Kirkum was murdered, DNA evidence was cutting-edge technology. The idea that you could take biological material from a crime scene, extract a genetic profile, and use it to identify someone was still relatively new. The databases that would make that identification possible were just beginning to be built. The techniques that would eventually solve the Valentine Jane Doe case, investigative genetic genealogy using consumer DNA testing databases, did not exist and would not be developed for another 25 years. And yet the Monroe County investigators preserved the DNA anyway, trusting that someday the technology would exist to use it. That faith in future technology, that willingness to preserve evidence even when it could not immediately be used, is what ultimately made the case solvable. Looking forward, the Valentine Jane Doe case offers lessons for how law enforcement should approach cold cases in the DNA era. First, preserve everything. Even if current technology cannot use particular evidence, future technology might. Second, never give up. Cases that seem unsolvable today may become solvable tomorrow as new tools become available. Third, invest in the infrastructure that makes advanced forensic work possible. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement's crime laboratory had the capability to do genetic genealogy work because the state had invested in developing that capability. Other states should follow that example. Fourth, maintain institutional memory. The dispatcher who took the first call on Valentine Jane Doe kept the case alive within the sheriff's office for 29 years. That kind of human commitment to cases matters enormously. The case also highlights the importance of addressing the systemic issues that made Wanda vulnerable in the first place. Young people fleeing abusive home situations need better support systems. The gaps in missing persons reporting need to be addressed, perhaps through technological solutions that make it easier to report and track missing individuals, perhaps through better coordination between child protective services and law enforcement, perhaps through public education about the importance of reporting when someone goes missing. Transient populations need better protection. The social services infrastructure in places like the Florida Keys needs to be strengthened. None of these solutions are simple, and none will prevent every tragedy. But they represent areas where systematic improvement could make a difference. For the family and friends of other unidentified victims, the other Jane and John Does still waiting for names, the Valentine Jane Doe case offers hope. It demonstrates that even after decades, identification is possible. The technology exists. The techniques work. If evidence has been properly preserved, if the case stays active, if investigators keep checking new databases and applying new methods, there is reason to hope for resolution. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System lists thousands of unidentified individuals. Each one of them has a name. Each one of them has or had a family. The Valentine Jane Doe case proves that those names can be recovered, that those families can be located, that identification is achievable even after extraordinary lengths of time. Finally, the case serves as a reminder of why true crime media matters when done responsibly. The coverage of the Valentine Jane Doe case over the years, by Unsolved Mysteries, by Crime Watch Daily, by countless podcasts and YouTube channels and online communities, kept public attention on the case. It kept pressure on law enforcement to keep working it. It kept Wanda's composite image circulating, increasing the chance that someone would recognize her. And when the resolution came, the true crime community was there to tell the complete story, to explain how the case was solved, to honor Wanda's memory. That is the proper role of true crime media: to amplify, to educate, to remember, to hold systems accountable, and above all, to treat victims and their families with dignity and respect. The Valentine Jane Doe case is closed now. Wanda Deann Kirkum has her name back. She rests in a cemetery in Oakfield, New York, her headstone bearing her real name, not Jane Doe. Her killer has been identified. The questions that haunted investigators for 29 years have been answered, but the case remains important. Important as a demonstration of what forensic science can achieve. Important as a reminder of why cold cases matter. Important as a lesson in what can go wrong when systems fail vulnerable young people. And most important as a memorial to a young woman who deserved better than what she got and who has finally, after 29 years, received at least this. Her name, her story, her place in memory. The story of Wanda Deann Kirkum is ultimately a story about resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. At 18 years old, she had already survived more than most people endure in a lifetime. She had grown up in a situation difficult enough that leaving home, with no money and no clear destination, seemed like the better option. That takes a kind of strength that is hard to comprehend unless you have been in a similar position. The decision to leave everything you have ever known, everyone you have ever depended on, and step out into complete uncertainty requires courage of an extraordinary kind. And she was not passive in her fate. The witnesses who saw her hitchhiking on Valentine's Day described a young woman who was moving with purpose. She was not aimlessly drifting. She was not frozen by fear or indecision. She was actively trying to get somewhere, to get away, to reach whatever she imagined might be waiting for her on the other side of the journey. She had agency, even in circumstances that offered her very few real choices. That agency, that refusal to simply accept the hand she had been dealt, is part of what makes her story so powerful. The tattoos she chose tell us something about who she was as a person. The heart with the word love inside, it was not chosen at random. It meant something to her. It represented something she valued, something she believed in, even if the world around her had not always shown her much love. The cross with sun rays was similarly symbolic, a marker of faith or hope or the belief that light exists even in darkness. These were not the choices of someone who had given up on the world. They were the choices of someone who still believed that goodness and love and hope were real things, worth marking permanently on her own body as a reminder. Her style, with the 4 piercings in each ear and the mismatched earrings, speaks to someone with a sense of self, someone who made deliberate choices about how she wanted to present herself to the world. She was not trying to blend in or disappear. She was asserting her own individuality, her own taste, her own identity. That kind of self-expression, that refusal to conform to expectations about how earrings should match or how many piercings are appropriate, is a small act of rebellion against conformity. It says, "This is who I am, and I am not apologizing for it." The perfect condition of her teeth, noted by investigators, suggests that at some point in her early life, someone cared enough to take her to regular dental appointments. Dental care is not something that happens by accident. It requires intention, consistency, follow-through. Someone, at some stage, was looking out for Wanda's well-being in at least this one respect. That care did not extend to protecting her from the other harms she experienced, but it existed. And it left a physical mark that investigators would later use as one piece of the puzzle in trying to understand who she was and where she had come from. When we think about Wanda's final hours, it is important to remember that she was not a statistic. She was not a case file waiting to be solved. She was a living, breathing human being with thoughts and feelings and hopes and fears. When she stood on the shoulder of U.S. Route 1 near mile marker 17 at approximately 6:30 in the evening on February the 14th, 1991, she had no way of knowing that she had less than 12 hours to live. She was thinking about wherever she was trying to get to. She was thinking about the cold she had left behind in New York. She was thinking about the warmth of Florida. She was thinking about whatever possibilities lay ahead on the road north. When Robert Lynn Bradley stopped his vehicle and offered her a ride, she made a decision based on the limited information available to her. Did he seem safe? Did he say something that put her at ease? Did she have any sense of danger, any intuition that something was wrong? Or did he simply seem like another driver willing to help a hitchhiker get where she needed to go? We will never know what passed through her mind in those moments. We will never know if she hesitated, if she had second thoughts, if some part of her sensed danger but got in anyway, because the alternative was standing alone on a dark highway with night falling and no other ride in sight. What we do know is that once she was in that vehicle, her options disappeared. Bradley did not take her north. He took her south, away from where she wanted to go, toward an isolated dirt road where no witnesses would see, where no one would hear, where he could do what he intended to do without interruption. The 20 miles between mile marker 17 and mile marker 35 would have taken perhaps 15 or 20 minutes to drive. That is how quickly her situation changed from hopeful to hopeless, from journey to nightmare. The violence that followed was documented in forensic detail, but the human experience of that violence is something no report can fully capture. She was beaten. She was raped. She was strangled with her own clothing while she was naked and defenseless. The terror she must have felt, the pain, the knowledge in her final moments that she was going to die alone and far from anyone who knew her name. These are realities that haunt everyone who has worked this case. Lieutenant Cuervo spoke about waking up in the middle of the night thinking about her. That is the weight of working a case like this. You carry the victim with you. You carry the knowledge of what was done to them. And you carry the obligation to find answers even when the trail has gone completely cold. For 29 years, that obligation went unfulfilled. Not because investigators did not care. Not because they did not try. But because the tools they needed did not yet exist. They had the DNA. They had the documentation. They had the determination. What they did not have was a way to connect the DNA to a name without a suspect already in custody or a missing persons report to match against. They were holding pieces of a puzzle that could not be assembled with the technology available at the time. But they held on to those pieces anyway. They preserved the evidence. They maintained the file. They kept the case active. They checked new databases as they became available. They never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, the breakthrough would come. And when investigative genetic genealogy emerged as a viable technique in the wake of the Golden State Killer case, they were ready. They had everything they needed. The DNA was still there, properly stored, properly documented, ready to be uploaded to genealogy databases and compared against the profiles of millions of ordinary people who had taken consumer DNA tests for completely different reasons. The connection to a fourth cousin was the thread that, when pulled carefully and patiently, unraveled the entire mystery. A fourth cousin shares less than 1% of DNA with Wanda Kirkum. That is an extraordinarily distant relationship. In practical terms, a fourth cousin is someone you would almost certainly never meet, someone who might live in a completely different part of the country, someone whose connection to you exists primarily on paper, in genealogical records going back to shared great-great-great-grandparents born in the 1800s. And yet that tiny percentage of shared DNA was enough. It was the thread investigators needed to begin building a family tree backward through time and then forward again through different branches until they arrived at a young woman from Hornell, New York who would have been 18 years old in 1991. The moment when investigators confirmed the match, when they knew with certainty that Valentine Jane Doe was Wanda Deann Kirkum, must have been both triumphant and heartbreaking. Triumphant because they had finally done what they had been trying to do for 29 years. They had given her back her name. Heartbreaking because with the name came the full weight of her story, the knowledge of what her childhood had been like, the understanding of why she had been on that highway alone, the realization that no one had reported her missing because her family had simply assumed she had wanted to disappear. The second breakthrough, the identification of Robert Lynn Bradley as her killer, came from an equally unexpected direction. The DNA from the Florida Keys crime scene was compared against the DNA from a completely different murder scene in Texas, a scene that had been processed 14 months after Wanda's death, in a jurisdiction that had no knowledge of the Valentine Jane Doe case. The match was unambiguous. Bradley had been at both scenes. The biological evidence did not lie. The fact that Bradley himself had been murdered meant that the case could never have the traditional ending of a prosecution and conviction. There would be no trial. No jury would hear the evidence. No judge would hand down a sentence. No victim impact statements would be read in court. Bradley escaped legal accountability by dying violently himself in circumstances that remain unsolved. But he did not escape identification. The DNA technology that did not exist when he killed Wanda Kirkum eventually caught up with him, even though he had been dead for decades by the time his name was connected to her case. In that sense, justice of a kind was achieved, even if it was not the traditional legal justice that families of murder victims usually hope for. For Brenda Chartraw and the Kirkum family, the resolution brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief that they finally knew what had happened. Grief that the worst possible outcome had been the true outcome all along. Guilt, perhaps, for not having reported Wanda missing, even though they had genuinely believed she had chosen to start a new life and cut contact. Gratitude toward the investigators who had never given up, who had preserved the evidence and kept working the case through decades of dead ends. and determination to give Wanda the burial and memorial she deserved, to bring her home to Oakfield and mark her grave with her real name. The donated headstone from Oakley Monuments represents the community responding to Wanda's story with generosity and compassion. The company did not know Wanda. They had no connection to her case beyond being located in the same region where she had gone to school. But when they learned that she needed a headstone, they stepped forward. That is what communities do when they are functioning at their best. They take care of their own, even retroactively, even when the person who needs care has been gone for 30 years. The fundraising efforts organized by Brenda Chartraw, including the basket raffle at the Caryville Inn in Oakfield, brought people together around a shared purpose. Giving Wanda a proper burial became a community project, a way for people who had never met her to nevertheless acknowledge that her life had value, that her death mattered, that she deserved to be remembered. The financial contributions were important practically, but they were also symbolically important. They represented the community saying, "You were one of ours, even if we did not know you, and we will not let you be forgotten." The cemetery in Oakfield where Wanda now rests is a quiet place, the kind of rural cemetery that dots the landscape of upstate New York, with old trees and weathered headstones marking generations of families who lived and died in the same small communities. Wanda's headstone is new, the stone clean and white, the lettering sharp and clear. It stands out among the older markers, a reminder that her story is recent, that the resolution of her case is fresh, that the grief of her family is still raw. But it also marks her as belonging there, as part of the landscape and the community, as someone who has finally come home. When visitors to the cemetery walk past Wanda's grave, if they stop to read the headstone, they will see her name, Wanda Deann Kirkum. They will see the years of her life, 18 years that should have been only the beginning of a much longer story. They may wonder about her. They may search online and find the story of Valentine Jane Doe and learn what happened to her. And in learning her story, they will help keep her memory alive. That is what memorials do. They ensure that the dead are not forgotten, that their stories continue to be told, that their lives continue to matter even after those lives have ended. The Valentine Jane Doe case has become part of the larger narrative of cold case investigation in the DNA era. It is studied in forensic science classes. It is discussed in law enforcement training sessions. It is featured in true crime media as an example of what can be achieved when new technology is applied to old evidence. But beyond its value as a case study or an example, it is fundamentally a human story. It is the story of a young woman who deserved better, and of the people who refused to give up on finding out what happened to her. The 4,000 pages of documentation represent not just paper, but human effort, human caring, human determination. Each page is someone doing their job with professionalism and dedication. Each tip followed up on, even the ones that led nowhere, represents someone taking the time to check, to verify, to rule out, to make sure that nothing was missed. The preservation of the DNA samples represents someone understanding that even if current technology could not use that evidence, future technology might, and therefore the evidence must be protected with the same care as if it would be used tomorrow. The dispatcher who kept the case top of mind for 29 years represents the human element that no amount of technology can replace. Databases and DNA profiles and genealogical research are all powerful tools. But tools need people to wield them. Tools need someone to remember to check them, to update them, to use them when the right moment arrives. The dispatcher who took that first call on the morning of February the 15th, 1991, and who carried the case in her heart for the rest of her career, was the human memory that kept Valentine Jane Doe from being forgotten entirely. She was the bridge between the past and the present, between the moment when Wanda died and the moment when Wanda's name was finally discovered. Detective Vince Weiner represents the next generation of cold case investigators, people who came to the case fresh and brought new eyes and new techniques to old evidence. Weiner could have looked at the 4,000 pages of documentation, at the 29 years of dead ends, and concluded that the case was unsolvable. But he did not. He saw opportunity where others might have seen futility. He understood that the new genetic genealogy techniques offered a pathway that had not existed before, and he partnered with the FDLE to make it happen. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement's investment in genetic genealogy capability is a model for what state agencies can do when they prioritize solving cold cases. The FDLE did not have to develop that expertise. They could have left it to federal agencies or private companies. But they chose to build the internal capacity to do the work themselves, to train their own analysts, to develop their own protocols, to create a system that could serve Florida's law enforcement community in working the state's cold cases. That investment paid off in the Valentine Jane Doe case and has paid off in numerous other cases since. Sheriff Rick Ramsey's announcement on June the 15th, 2020, marked the official resolution of the case, but it also marked something larger. It marked the validation of decades of work by dozens of people. It marked the success of a new forensic technique that had skeptics when it first emerged. It marked the power of institutional commitment and human persistence. And it marked the restoration of Wanda Deann Kirkum's identity and dignity. She was no longer Jane Doe. She was Wanda. She had a family. She had a community. She had a story. And that story, finally, was being told correctly, with her real name at the center of it. The media coverage that followed the announcement brought national attention back to the case and to the techniques that had solved it. People across the country learned about Wanda. They learned about investigative genetic genealogy. They learned about the power of preserving evidence and never giving up on cold cases. And they learned that even after decades, justice of a kind can still be achieved. The stories in major news outlets, the coverage on true crime programs, the discussions on social media, all of this served to amplify Wanda's story and ensure that her name would not be forgotten again. For other families with missing loved ones, the Valentine Jane Doe case offers both hope and a template. Hope, because it demonstrates that even when decades have passed, identification is still possible. A template, because it shows the steps that need to be taken. Preserve DNA evidence, maintain active case files, check new databases as they become available, partner with state and federal agencies that have specialized capabilities, and never give up. The resolution of Wanda's case does not guarantee that every case will be resolved, but it proves that resolution is possible, and that possibility is sometimes enough to keep families going through the long years of waiting. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System continues to list thousands of individuals who remain unidentified. Each one of those cases represents a family somewhere who may not know that their loved one is gone, or who knows but does not know where to look. The Valentine Jane Doe case, now resolved, offers a roadmap for how other cases might be resolved using similar techniques. Upload the DNA to genealogy databases. Find the distant relatives. Build the family trees. Work methodically through the branches until you find the individual who matches all the known characteristics. It is painstaking work. It requires skill and patience. But it works. The ethical debates around investigative genetic genealogy will continue. Privacy advocates will continue to raise legitimate concerns about law enforcement accessing databases populated by people who never consented to their data being used for that purpose. Law enforcement will continue to argue that the public good served by solving violent crimes outweighs those privacy concerns. The tension between these two positions will likely never be fully resolved. But the guidelines developed by the Department of Justice, the protocols adopted by organizations like GED-Match, and the ongoing dialogue between stakeholders represent efforts to find a balance that protects both privacy and public safety. What cannot be debated is that the technique works. It has solved hundreds of cases. It has identified victims and perpetrators who would otherwise have remained unknown indefinitely. It has brought closure to families who had been waiting decades for answers. And it has demonstrated that law enforcement's ability to solve cold cases continues to evolve in ways that were unimaginable even a generation ago. The question is not whether the technique should be used, but how it should be used, under what circumstances, with what safeguards, and with what oversight. Wanda Deann Kirkum's case stands as proof that the technique can be used responsibly and effectively to achieve outcomes that serve both justice and human dignity. She was identified through genetic genealogy. Her killer was identified through a combination of genetic genealogy and cross-jurisdictional database comparison. The investigation was conducted with professionalism and care. The family was treated with respect. The media coverage was responsible. The outcome, while not perfect, was as good as could reasonably be hoped for given the circumstances. That is the standard against which other uses of the technique should be measured. As we reflect on Wanda's story, It is important to remember that she was not the only victim of the circumstances that led to her death. The systems that failed her, the family dysfunction that drove her to leave home, the absence of social services support that left her hitchhiking alone, the gaps in missing persons reporting that meant no one looked for her. All of these represent failures that affect thousands of vulnerable young people every year. Some of them survive. Some of them do not. Wanda did not survive. But her story, now told in full, can perhaps help prevent similar tragedies in the future by illuminating the specific points where intervention might have made a difference. If there had been better child protective services, Wanda might not have had to leave home at 18. If there had been better support systems for young people fleeing abusive situations, she might have had somewhere safe to go instead of hitchhiking alone in Florida. If there had been better coordination between states in missing persons reporting, her family might have filed a report even if they believed she had left voluntarily. If there had been better social services infrastructure in the Florida Keys, she might have had resources available when she found herself in need. None of these interventions would have guaranteed her safety, but any one of them might have changed the trajectory of her story. The broader lesson of the Valentine Jane Doe case is that cold cases matter, that victims matter, that the obligation to seek truth and justice does not expire with time, and that advancing technology continues to create new opportunities to solve cases that once seemed hopeless. The dedication of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, the technical capability of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy as a forensic tool, and the human persistence of individuals like the dispatcher who took the first call and Detective Weiner who applied the new techniques, all came together to achieve something that mattered enormously, giving Wanda Deann Kirkum back her name. Her name is carved in stone now. Her story is told. Her memory is preserved. And the lesson of her case will continue to inform cold case investigation for years to come. That is not justice in the traditional legal sense, but it is justice of a kind. It is the justice of truth, of memory, of recognition, of dignity restored. It is the justice of a community saying, "You mattered. Your life had value. Your death was not acceptable, and we will not forget you." Wanda Deann Kirkum, born in Hornell, New York, 18 years old when she died. Identified 29 years later through the power of DNA and the persistence of people who cared. Rest in peace. Say her name. Remember her story. And never stop looking for the truth. This is Buried Secret Media.